Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Semiagog. Hello, Semiagog. How are you doing?
I'm very well today, sir. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be speaking to you, Semiagog. I'm just going to say Oliver because I have a slight lisp and a speech impediment and I don't like to incorrectly pronounce words. So I will just call you Oliver. So, Oliver, are you a linguist?
No, not at all.
Okay, but you have done some research in that area, right?
Well, I've done research in an area that is usually claimed by linguists, but the focus of my research is in showing that they have no right to lay claim to this area and
Okay,
to shape discourse surrounding
okay.
it.
And what is your area of specialization then?
I came from branding, marketing, branding, and advertising. So my background is with what are often non-linguistic signs and how they are used to integrate behavior, in this case, promoting transactions, purchases, sales. And so I moved from this realm of how marks are used to organize the world of commerce into a broader context for it.
All right then. And you argue that linguists, they do not have a monopoly on language. So shed some light on some of your objections to how linguistics and other areas of language-based research are practiced today.
Well, I'm certainly no expert on linguistics, but to give you the basic picture, the idea is, well, let's start from the approach to marks and signs that is normally taken by linguists. Either they cannot really understand or contextualize any given mark or sign that they come across. For example, in archaeological digs that come from a period that we would call prehistory, they would refer to something that they can't understand, that is a mark or a sign, as proto-writing, because they distinguish, or rather, they define writing as something that represents in some fashion speech. And so for them, in order for writing to exist, spoken language must first exist because heard, everyone knows that writing represents speech. And so they have neatly framed discussion of these phenomena in such a way that the only thing that is writing is something that represents speech, and everything else can be dismissed as proto-writing.
All right, Oliver, and you publish a piece. Your piece is titled "Marks: A Distinct Subcategory Within Writing as Integrationally Defined." Now, Oliver, your idea is a bit interesting. You are creating a linkage between human language and developments in the animal kingdom. But before we get to this exciting area of research, I am going to refer to another article titled Multi-Species Emergent Textualities, Writing and Reading in Ecologies of Selves. And Oliver, you are actually cited in this piece.
Oh, I wasn't aware of it. What's the date on it?
It's a Scholar 2021.
Oh, really?
Yes,
Interesting.
written by someone called Diogo de Carvalho
Hmm.
and someone else called Andre.
Very interesting.
Yes,
Well,
and
I'll listen.
this quote is of interest to your research. Etienne Benson pointed out that to see even the most human of texts as nothing but human, as entirely devoid of particular animals, the animal in general or animality, is to succumb to one of the most powerful humanist illusions. Expound, Oliver, because I know that you agree with Etienne.
Well, it is likely that I would agree, but you will forgive me for not saying clearly that I do so, having not yet read it or the
Yes,
context.
and you're not a linguist, but just show the link between animal development and human writing. This is the essence of the interview and your research.
Right. Well, the first thing that we have to do is set aside this notion of language. There is a very common view, and that view is that all forms of human communication can ultimately be reduced to language as sort of a descriptive metaphor. And that is one of the great weaknesses that linguistics and linguisticians have sort of dumped us into or framed for us, this idea that speech is the fundamental way that we must understand human communication of all sorts of types. So the basic idea is that, from my perspective, there is a strong case to be made for the idea that writing precedes speech. The issue is how one defines writing. And you will see that in my paper, there's a mention of the idea of, or there's mention specifically of integrational or integrationist study of writing. And that is a particular semiotics that was developed and set forth by Roy Harris, who was a professor at Oxford, a professor of linguistics, as it happens, but one who was not trapped within the framework that linguistics receive, that frankly most academics receive and accept unthinkingly. It makes perfect sense, of course, that academics would exist within a textual tradition and would be trained with blinders sufficient to keep them from looking at anything outside that tradition. So my view is that, put briefly, is that animals have been using marks to integrate their behavior within space for thousands of years, for millennia, because we see the use of marks in space to integrate behavior among insects, among reptiles, among higher mammals. It's only when we get to human beings that everybody suddenly decides that there's this separation that has occurred. That they're fools for anthropocentrism and the idea that writing, which must, as they've defined it, come after language, this idea that it is a purely human phenomenon. And even when they look at examples of communication that come from the animal world outside of human society and convention, they tend to apply the metaphor of language in attempting to understand what's going on. So since animals have long used marks made in space in order to integrate their behavior, territorial marks, environmental marks, resource marks, if one expands one's understanding of what writing is and takes the definition that Roy Harris proposed in his excellent work, Signs of Writing, which is that they are lasting signs in space that are used to integrate behavior, and that there's, setting aside any need for the quote unquote telementational model of Saussure, where you imagine that, a message is sent through a speech circuit from party A to party B, and we can imagine that it's heard and received. If we dispense with all of that and understand that writing itself, if broadly defined, is not visual, but spatial, and that it is used to integrate behavior, then a whole variety of things are revealed as forms of writing. Tracks on the ground, territorial marks scratched into the bark of trees, scent marks. And so if we define writing more broadly, we can see that the case can be made that animals have been writing for a very, very long time in evolutionary terms before human beings ever appeared. And that opens up all sorts of new horizons of consideration for how we organize ourselves socially, and how first I should say that we can distinguish between writing broadly defined, which is what I'm doing, and then there's writing proper, which is the idea of writing that represents speech. If we look at it in the way that I'm talking about, we can see ways in which human beings organize themselves that are below the threshold, let us say, of word-based reasoning and writing proper, but nevertheless exert an enormous influence on what we do and how we do it.
All right, Oliver. Your ideas are quite interesting. I have some interest in linguistics, but from a different perspective. I care more about the nexus between language and economic development. So during the course of this discussion, we may not explore this issue in its entirety because you're not an expert in economics. But Oliver, this is when I got your email, I really started to to ponder something quite fascinating. Did animals impact the evolution of writing in human societies?
Well, my argument
Yeah.
is that writing is it comes directly from animals. Either we have innate predispositions, what some people might call instinct, and that it causes us to quote unquote write in our environments, broadly understood, or with thousands of years spent developing evolutionarily side by side with animals, we would have picked up their practices. So take a look at how, for example, people who go into public restrooms seem impelled to scratch or write aggressive and sexual messages. And it's precisely in the bathrooms where they've got overlapping scent signatures. And then think about how dogs patrolling a route come up on a scent mark left by another dog. And this can provoke concern about defense of their territory. It can cause a response related to aggression. So we can see in human beings, I mean, as I mentioned in my paper I sent to you, children seem to be compelled to scratch and write things on tree trunks. So the idea is that, yes, it's a continuum. The basic idea is, instead of taking the anthropocentric position that we are entirely separate from the animal world, and that writing emerged long after human beings became civilized, or at least long after they developed conventionalized spoken language. Instead of taking that position, we can come from the other direction and say that writing of some kind, if broadly defined, has always been with us because it is an animal inheritance.
All right, Oliver. But this is a challenge to your thesis that could be posited by some. Can marks, signs, whatever we wish to call them, do they signify abstract thought?
Well, there's no need to worry at all about what they signify one way or another. And that's the beauty of the semiotic approach that Roy Harris has taken. It's simply enough to know that these marks in space allow us to integrate and regulate our behavior. So take, for example, the idea of an animal that patrols a route at the border of its territory. These marks, and this is a whole separate aspect, which is very, very important, which is the idea that these marks, while susceptible to acts of deception, these marks are non-arbitrary. And by that, I mean, if an animal is regularly patrolling its border, then any other animal that comes and approaches is going to see deposits of the scent marks or the visual advertisements associated with them at the border of the territory. And it will know what type of animal it is based on that scent signature that is patrolling. It will know how often it patrols because there will be a higher concentration of scent marks deposited along that border. And it will know important things about the animal that made the marks. If it's a conspecific, an animal that is, of the same species as the one that detected its marks, it can determine all sorts of things, including very likely the health of the animal, its sex, perhaps even its age. So the marks at the borders of the territories tell us things that are non-arbitrary. They fit under the idea, for those who are familiar with it, of in the subdivisions of Peirce's semiotic, they fit under the idea of icon, which is a mark that bears a direct relationship to the thing that made it. So in human culture, we have fingerprints, right, which are considered to be a direct indicator of the presence of the person that made the sign. So you don't have to talk about with a fingerprint whether or not they communicate some abstract idea. The simple presence fixes the person who left the fingerprint in space and time at the place where the fingerprint was left. And this is admissible in a court of law, whereas all sorts of talk about, this or that idea, or, a witness's testimony and the rest, they're not as strong in terms of evidence, in terms of establishing what we call fact as the simple presence of the mark. Likewise, tracks on the ground. Do we have to say that they communicate an abstract thought? If I'm a hunter, even one arguably operating, one of our hominid ancestors operating before spoken language in its conventional form emerged, and I'm tracking an animal that I wounded with my atlatl or whatever, and it went running off and it's leaving a trail of blood and tracks, I can follow it. I can see from the disposition of the tracks, whether it's moving quickly or slowly, to an experienced eye of a hunter. I can see whether or not there's a whole bunch of blood on the ground that's been left behind by the animal. I can see, the pacing, as I said, the speed with which it's moving, whether or not it begins to falter, whether it's favoring a leg, and I can get a sense of how much distance it's crossed. And by reading the sequence of the tracks on the ground, reading broadly understood, I have what I believe is the first clear example of narrative, the idea that this event follows this event in sequence. And it would be no accident that even the way in which we lay characters out on a page, what Harris would call internal syntagmatics, mirrors the external syntagmatics of reading the tracks of the animal on the ground. We read characters in sequential and aligned order, and therefore we know what elements precede and which elements succeed in the sequence across the graphic space, most often a two-dimensional graphic space on a page. So these are just a few ways I'm tapping it. I could go very deep into it, but I don't want to just
please
drone.
go deeply into the issue, because I have some questions and some counterpoints, but continue to speak. I will tell you when to stop.
Well, the basic idea is that there is no need to quote unquote understand in the sense of communicating an abstract thought or even phonetic values. There are a number of ways that we can subdivide these marks that many others would call, proto-writing or not writing proper or semasiographics. They come up with all sorts of nonsense to describe these things based on how they've defined them as being outside the realm of proper consideration because they're not writing proper. Think about scent caches that are left on food. So wolves are going to bury some half-eaten thing to get back to it later, and they'll mark the scent cache with urine. They can find it in a particular location, and any other conspecific, any other wolf that comes across it will know that it is a resource cache, or at least know that it is a scent mark in that location. Or think about, for example, how animals, say you're walking a dog and you're going along the normal route that you walk with that dog, and then the dog happens to come up on a spot where there is a competing scent signature. So this is the route the dog patrols. It's just, its tongue's hanging out, its tail is wagging, and it's moving right along. And then it comes up on this new scent mark. Some new dog has arrived and urinated on its favorite fire hydrant or tree. So the dog comes over and begins to sniff up the trunk of this tree, let's say, and its snout hits the point at which the scent was left by itself the last time it left a urine mark, a scent signature. And then its nose sort of continues up the tree, and it gets to the point where the new mark has been left. And it can tell on this vertical axis that the new mark is higher from the ground than the mark it left, which meant that its equipment for leaving a scent signature, this new arrival, has left a scent mark that's higher. Its equipment is higher off the ground, which means it's got longer legs, which means it's physically bigger, or at least physically taller. So there's no need to have some abstract thought communicated, because the dog sniffing, it sniffs up past the mark it made, and it knows that whatever has come along is making a mark higher up that indicates that it's larger. And we know how an animal's size directly relates to defensive territory and dominance displays. People have often seen cats, when they're about to get in a fight, their fur will stand up to make them seem to be larger. Animals in competition, aggressive displays, they'll come up on their hind legs to seem bigger. So again, we see an example of how the ability to read it, so to speak, in the conventional sense that we've pulled some knowledge forth from it, or it represents some abstract thing or some conventional thing, doesn't matter at all. Or take the example of signatures, right? People very often write signatures in order to make them very difficult to imitate. And in the course of making them difficult to imitate, they will very often make them illegible. the vast majority of people's signatures are more or less illegible, because the point of the signature is to act as a trace, indicating reliably that that person made the mark and no other person. If you were to simply print it neatly in all caps characters so that it could be understood, which would be the focus on the idea that it would communicate some abstract message, then there would be no need for the signature, and the focus would be on reading it and understanding it. But what do we see when you actually go to sign some important document where it's important that everyone knows that it was you that made the mark, which is why you have to have a notary's stamp and you have to have a witness present, and they want to date it. We can go into dates another time because they're essentially like a scent mark that fades with time and indicates whether or not the mark was made recently. Same for yearly tags for automobiles. They're marks that have to be periodically renewed, just like a scent mark is, because they fade over time. That's the fundamental archetype there. But coming back around to the signature, you've got the idea that you have to sign it, which is often illegible. And underneath it, there's a separate blank in which you're supposed to write your name out neatly so that people can understand it. So we can see that the whole point of the signature is not to communicate identity in the conventional sense that we would think with writing, where we can sound out the L, the I, the P, the T, the O, and the N, and know that it says Lipton. No, that's what the blank underneath is for, so that someone can figure out what it actually says. The signature itself is nothing more than indicating that you were physically present at that location at that time, and it is your unique mark that only you can make. We see the same thing reflected, for example, in people who traverse graffiti routes in urban areas. They literally call it patrolling, and they mark their environment with what they call tags. And what is the characteristic of tags that is most immediately salient for people coming across them for the first time? It is the fact that it's more or less illegible. Only the people making those tags and within that culture are likely to be able to figure out more than, one or two of the letters that are so oddly displayed that it's impossible to figure out what they are. It's so that the person leaving the tag knows that it's his mark, that only he knows how to make it. And it doesn't even matter if other people can break it down to its core elements of what letters are involved and what it says. It's a much more immediate representation of my presence, my regular presence along this route. And the people who patrol these routes, leaving their tags, just like a dog walking in the park and leaving scent signatures, compete. So that's why you see the graffiti layered up over itself time and time and time again in these urban environments, because the person gets their graffiti covered with a mark, and then the next one comes along and puts his or her graffiti mark on top of it, showing that the territory is contested. There are people who've studied graffiti, for example, who found that many of the bolder graffiti artists who want to make a name for themselves climb up high onto difficult structures to get to them way up in the air where they're readily visible, even at considerable danger to themselves, in order to leave a mark so high up that no one else can get to it. And we can see how that corresponds to the idea of the higher mark indicating the larger animal, indicating the stronger claim to territory, the greater size, and all the rest. So there are many examples like this, and all of them tend to indicate a number of important things. One is the relationship of a person to space. So the marks made in space indicate a claim to territory. And the other feature there is this idea that there is a direct relationship in terms of physical presence and of time, in terms of marks fading. If an animal comes along, and as I was talking about before when I did that brief aside on dates, if an animal comes along and smells a scent mark, but it's very old, then it's immediately going to know, whether it parses out some abstract understanding or not, that this territory was once patrolled, but does not seem to have been in a long time. So it might be on half guard rather than on full guard. And there are other ways that these marks in space affect behavior. We know that animals tend to be most ferocious and strong in defending their territory when they're pushed back to their areas of their nests at the center of their territory, that they tend to be more willing to back up and not fight when they're at the periphery of their territory. And their territory is understood by them in whatever fashion it is, based upon the scent marks that they use to orient themselves. So
Yes. So Oliver, you're so lucid. That was a mouthful, but I have some questions for you, Oliver. Do you plan to systematize your research? Because basically, during the duration of this conversation, you're listing the functions of signs. That's what you're doing.
Yes, but I'm trying to put them on a non-arbitrary basis. So my problem is that I am not an ethologist. I am not a scientist. In order to carry this to the scientific community, I would have to work with scientists who are capable, and I'd like to, by the way, who are
Yes.
capable of creating experiments, because nobody in science, and rightly so, gives a damn about any of this if it cannot be established that it has predictive value. So for that portion of my work, I'm going to have to partner with scientists capable of establishing that through the crafting of experiments, which is a high art in itself, and one that I don't have much exposure to. So I'd need
Well,
assistance with it.
you can always learn, and I'm sure that there are good people in the dissident academic community who will be of immense value in your endeavor. So, for example, Oliver, I'm listening to you and I'm saying, in pre-literate societies, okay, before I divulge into this new era of research, another point, it just came to me. Are signs a medium to think? Are signs a medium for us to communicate with other minds?
Yes, of course they are. You can open up a book and read like Marx's garbage if you want to, and to some extent participate with his thought process. So clearly, yes, they are.
Yes.
But I did want to mention, since you brought up the idea of a pre-literate society, under this expanded definition, things like Walter Ong's distinction between the oral and the literate, they disappear. Because under this model, there's no such thing as a pre-literate society. All
Yeah.
human beings across the world have always used marks, as animals have. So if you define it as writing proper and you say that writing must be something that represents speech, sure, you can argue that there is a pre-literate phase, and you can argue that there is a pre-historical phase. However, if you instead approach this from the perspective that there are marks, which are a form of writing, distinct from writing proper, but the foundation for it, then there is no such thing as a pre-literate society. Everyone has used marks to organize their behavior in space. And we can go a step further and dispense with the model of prehistory and history, because let's just face it, prehistory, as everyone knows, is simply shit that happened before writing. And so if we say, wait a minute, we've got a different form of writing and a broader definition of it, it cannot give us the clear picture that writing proper can, but it can certainly tell us more than we can see at present because of our blinkered way of looking at it, the way that, linguistic discourse dominates academia, and in particular the humanities. So one of the things that I'm playing with is the idea that we can approach it, instead of prehistory and history, we can perhaps use a model that is more like history, subhistory, and unhistory. But that's something I'm still working on. Now to come back around.
You may go ahead before I continue. Yeah, I'm just brimming with ideas, but you may go ahead.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to say, because you asked me, am I going to systematize these ideas? So on the one hand, there is approaching it from the perspective of the hard sciences, which will require the assistance of scientists who have a head for building experiments and establishing predictive value or ruling it out. That's one half, and I would like to do that. But what I'm working on at present is more metapolitical, because the left has thus far dominated our world because of what you can call a pilpul, which you can call wrangling over letters, which you can call the fallout of the religions of the book. I like to just call it Scrabble babble. But essentially, the left has come in with their idea that signification relationships are always arbitrary. And that comes from a very, very brilliant Swiss linguist named Saussure, who wrote a course on general linguistics. He's central to comparative linguistics, historical linguistics. He's a brilliant mind.
Yes,
And
the people on many of those earlier scholars on the left, they were bright, not like their descendants today.
yes, and in Saussure's case, he came in and established this idea of the signifier and the signified. And so you could say that the word tree signifies what we would go out and look at outside as a tree, right? And he observed, as many people have, that if you turned around and you said arbor in Latin or ağaç in Turkish, both of those words mean tree. So what he determined is this idea that, well, obviously it's based on convention, because there's no fundamental necessary relationship between this set of sounds, tree, and what we look at as a tree, nor is there any fundamental necessary relationship of the word ağaç or the word arbor. And clearly, human beings simply settle upon these terms by convention, which is to say the relationship between what we use to signify and the thing signified is always already arbitrary. And the left, first off, just swarmed into linguistics departments because some understanding of how people construe reality around them promised power for them. And so they're very happy to get in there and figure out how they could manipulate language based on their idea of a tabula rasa and all their social engineering experiments in their other utopian pastimes. And so the fundamental idea of linguistics departments is that meaning is arbitrary, which is why you get all the politically correct crap where they're like, well, let's just rename it and that'll make it new. And powered by this ideology, they have swarmed like vermin through every aspect of academia and pushed this idea of arbitrariness with them everywhere. And so what I'm attempting to do in terms of this metapolitical project, it's the book I'm working on now, is to take this basic understanding of non-arbitrary signification, of signification shared by human beings and animals, of a type of signification that doesn't require some addle-pated utopian notion that human beings are utterly distinct from animals because they crossed this abyss that comes with conventional language that no other species share. Instead, you can look at signification as a continuum, and you can look at signification as something that need not be arbitrary, and that at its roots isn't arbitrary. And so I hope to put together some sort of foundation. It sounds a little bit overly ambitious and self-important, but I'm going to try it nevertheless, to establish some kind of foundation, establishing that meaning not only doesn't have to be arbitrary, but then down in its roots, it fundamentally is not, because we have to remember that the ways in which animals use their marks, which are territorial marks, that's related to territory, whereas the left is trying to deterritorialize and introduce the idea that everything is convertible, right? Resource marks, this is an aspect that ties deeply to economics in general. Look at the idea of fiat currency, where the value assigned to anything is simply there because of a mark on paper. It's simply a piece of paper that has a mark, and it is the mark itself that stands for value, which is fundamentally arbitrary because it's off of any standard. Again, we see the theme of deterritorialization, of arbitrariness, of social engineering, of utopianism. And at the heart of it is what I call the thin wedge that they've hammered in between the signified and the signifier and their addle-pated commie bullshit. This fundamental notion that everything is arbitrary. So to answer your question, on the one side, there is the idea of going after this with folks from the scientific side of things. On the other side of it, there is the idea of a metapolitical project that is fundamentally a theory of signs and signification that can be counterposed against all this utopian nonsense. That is fundamentally about the idea that this is non-arbitrary, that these signification relationships are motivated, and that will, with any luck, reconnect us to what some would call sort of the great chain of being.
Oliver, some evolutionary anthropologists also argue that animals have an inclination for political organization. And during the discussion, I said to myself, signs are employed by animals to project political power and to organize themselves in groups. This is something that you could study.
I have poked at it a bit, even in the paper that I sent over to you, but I would have to work more closely with ethologists with exposure to this. And there's some promising sort of developments in semiotics, particularly out in Tallinn in Estonia, if I'm remembering correctly. There's a whole sort of subsection of semiotics that's mostly ignored by the academics. You can call it biosemiotics or zoo semiotics. It's based on the work of Uxküll, and he looks closely at semiotics and animals. There are others like Heine Heidegger, who was in charge of zoos in Switzerland back in the middle of the 20th century, people who have looked at these things. But yes, they do it generally based on hierarchy. And so if you want to look at how social organizations work in a way that is much more functional, look at how human beings in the West, in liberal societies, organize themselves. On the one hand, they have civil society with individual rights and English common law and habeas corpus and all this sort of thing. Then over on the other side, for crisis, they have what I call the break glass in case of fire option, which is to call in the military, institute martial law, etc. And what happens when you institute martial law? Well, first off, you have an absolute hierarchy established along a chain of command, and that is shown with rank, with physical emblems that are displayed on the clothing, and they immediately and without question establish who gives the commands and who obeys. You also get war crimes like perfidy, which are recognized, I believe, under the Geneva Convention, certainly under many of these international conventions and agreements. The idea of perfidy is where you operate under a sign, pretending to be a thing that you are not really. So, for example, if I were to move improvised explosives devices around within a war theater in a truck marked with the Red Cross, the world's most effective, when it works, apotropaic symbol, I could be accused of perfidy. Look at terms like false flag, right? So in human society, we have sort of the loose arrangement of civil society. It's based on contracts. And so the most important marks are signatures, if they're not state signs like a badge on a policeman, or if we're not talking about like control of outdoor advertising, which usually falls on municipalities because they're very, very concerned about what is displayed outside. If we're not talking about fiat currency, because after all, if I ripped off your work and reprinted something that was copyrighted, no one's going to show up at my house with submachine guns. However, if I'm reprinting fiat currency, that's a mark they do care about, so they'll show up. But over on the other side, you have the idea of the Organization for Crisis, which is an absolute hierarchy. Outside of liberal Western societies, you very often find that there is no distinction. That, so if you look at the Mongol Empire, the social organization is the military organization. In many feudal societies, you will see that is the case, at least in certain levels and areas where the high-ranking aristocrats in civil life are also the war leaders. But we have come up with this way of dividing it, where we have sort of a civil society, and then we have our break glass in case of fire. And for that crisis response, what do we go back to except the most straightforward system, where the signification immediately indicates rank? It does it through non-linguistic signs, the chevron for officers, or, the silver bird for a colonel. These things don't have to have a linguistic value, but they indicate rank based on that table of the different ranks and which ones command, which ones obey, which itself corresponds to that tree trunk we talked about earlier, where the largest animal pisses higher up and is more likely to be able to assert itself aggressively and make its will and enforce its will.
Oliver, so I like history, and historically it has been shown that mechanical signs do impact societal organization and the complexity of bureaucracy. So, for example, in the Incas, for example, they utilized the quipu, and the quipu was a method to communicate and analyze data in essence, and they did not possess formal writing based on how we perceive writing today. So again, when we're looking at the trajectory of human history, it is evident that in the pre-industrial era, writing was not a necessary condition for civilizational complexity.
Except I would argue that there was never a time when writing didn't exist. And so once again, you see the way in which the assumptions and the context, the frameworks that we almost unconsciously apply to everything have to be revised. So take a look at kipu. For those who don't know, it's a type of knotted cord that can be used to record and transmit, so to speak, messages. There are many sorts of things like this. Obviously you can read, or it's arguable at least, that you could read a kipu with your eyes closed if you knew the shapes and forms of the knots. So we see right there that it's very likely that writing itself, here's another fundamental assumption that's utterly false, that writing is visual. It's not, it's spatial. And Roy Harris, the professor I mentioned, pointed that out in a brilliant example with Braille. How could writing be visual if you can read it with your fingertips? It is, in fact, spatial, which brings us right back around to the first writing surface, which is the ground or territory around us. And that brings us back to the idea of the integration of behavior. Look at the Roman termini, the terminus, the border stone, right? That would be placed in different locations to indicate borders, and codes, raised stele with laws placed upon them. Or if you want to step outside the writing proper phase, where we could actually decipher those stones, as we did with the Rosetta Stone, or Code of Hammurabi or whatever, take a look at the standing stones across Central Asia, where what are called tamgas, which are usually non-linguistic marks or signs corresponding with clans or tribal groupings. When they agreed on something, they would all appear and they would put their tamga, their clan sign, very much like a hallmark or a housemark or German Hausmarken. They would put their clan sign, indicating that they had marked this stone in agreement with all these others whose marks appeared. If you look at contracts from the medieval period or the early modern period, you will see very often that the scroll with the compact will be enclosed in a box that is painted with the coats of arms of the people who signed it. If you unroll that scroll, you will see dangling from it on little vellum strips the seals of each of the parties that was party to the convention. Take a look at the cave walls of Chauvet from the Upper European Paleolithic in France, where you see human handprints. These are just human tracks. So think about making your mark, leaving your seal. It's essentially leaving a track to show that you were present and agreed to this thing. Now, that's just one area where I'm
Oliver, another area. I'm interested in the diplomatic relations of pre-colonial Africa, and signs were also employed in pre-colonial diplomacy. Another thought that just came to my mind.
Yes, well, you might want to have a look at, there's a whole set that you would have to consider if you want to look into what is not usually called writing, but actually is. In particular in West Africa. Now, I'm no expert on it, but I can tap some of the themes because I know someone who studied it very closely. In West Africa, you have the Orisha systems. Yes. And as you probably know, coming from the islands, this leads to things like Palomonte, Condomble, Pontos Rescados, Santeria, right? And in all these systems, Voudon, you see that they make marks upon the ground. And these ground signs are used in order to signify, for example, a particular loa or god you want to bring down. So there will be a particular veve or ground sign in Voudon, for example, that corresponds to Erzule, right, goddess of the sea, or one that corresponds to Gede, right, the god of the dead, or Ogun of war, right? And these signs are used within their...
Oliver, pronounce the word again. It's not voodoo. My teacher is an expert in American history and in Haitian history, and he pronounced the word correctly. So just pronounce the word again for our listener. It is not voodoo.
Voudon.
Yes, that is the correct pronunciation. But continue.
Yes. So these ground signs are used. First off, you have to be initiated to understand them. So you've got like leopard societies out of West Africa, like in one of the systems, these ground signs that are probably ancestral to the Veve and the rest, they're called Nisibidi. So yeah, there's quite a bit of that going on in Africa, and it's the sort of thing that would be overlooked as being proto-writing based on this absurd definition where we're only to accept things that capture spoken language as being writing. And thereby we wipe everything else off the map that should be an aspect of consideration. If you don't think that Nisibidi is a kind of writing in West Africa, the Leopard Society is going to show up and kick ass and take names if you don't pay attention to marks they've left that indicate that they are displeased with something. Just like think about if you see a set of lion tracks running through the middle of your campsite, so you wake up in the morning and a set of lion tracks appeared, running between the fire and your tents, that can be read. That will result in a change to your behavior. It will cause you to organize yourself differently if you come across it. So there is a continuum running all the way from the scent marks and all the way down to what's called chemical communication with insects, which are still a form of writing insofar as they are lasting or relatively lasting, and they are made in space for purposes of integrating behavior. They are writing. And from the chemical communication of insects all the way up to what we call writing proper, we have a continuum. And the last piece I should throw in there is about deception, because with chemical communication, we have allomones, which are basically deceptive chemical signals, and they're generally used on interspecific context, which is to say between species. Within species, the general idea is that the general idea, I shouldn't even say idea because that suggests that a choice was made at some point, but the evolutionary framework and the selective pressure seems to have come down on the side of being able to rely upon marks in your environment. Because if you can't rely on the marks in your environment, then you cannot, for example, heed a warning. You cannot, if you cannot rely upon and make behavioral determinations based on the marks in your environment, if they're not reliable, then you're going to have a much higher likelihood of dying. Whereas, so that's intraspecific within a species. So we tend, it seems evolutionarily, that the strategy is favored where the marks can be relied upon.
Oliver, you are just so brilliant. Yeah. Whenever you speak, I just keep creating these new ideas and theories. The evolutionary benefits of signs. This is another area of research, but continue.
Yes, and the idea that, again, because it's non-arbitrary, think about how hard it is to lie with a scent signature. So women will talk about chemistry, right? So they'll be like, well, I met Johnny and, we had great chemistry. What does that mean? That really means, whether they can articulate it or not, that they smelled the guy and whatever it is that came in and hit the hypothalamus and, kicked off their endocrine system was something that their body found pleasing. If, for example, they meet somebody and they say they had bad chemistry, well, it probably means, frankly, that whether they're conscious of it or not, they didn't like how they smelled. And that is communication at a level that is fully sub-rational.
It is
and
cerebral.
Yet look at how
it's cerebral communication, quite cerebral.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by that.
It's high-level communication. Let me give a perfect example. So an evolutionary anthropologist submitted on this show that rituals are a better marker of conformity and commitment to group goals, because it's hard to deceive using a ritual. Because of vocabulary and our ability to manipulate others with words, language enables us to become more efficient at deceiving, but signs are more rigid than language. A sign is specific. It is hard to manipulate a sign.
Well, it can be harder.
Yes.
But I do want to point out that in an interspecific context, that is between species, not within a species. Between species, you will see one that has a parasitical or otherwise negative relationship with another species that it controls or exploits. And chemical communication can allow that, allomones. There are also examples, when I was talking before about the idea of an animal that gets up on a tree and urinates higher. People have captured pandas in China doing handstands next to tree trunks in order to get their genitals higher and leave a scent signature higher up to seem as though they're bigger than they are, in order to deceive. So deception does happen in the animal world, but it is it is more rare because it's more difficult to lie with a scent signature. If you haven't been there, it fades, right? And chemical communication entails actual microscopic particles of whatever that is entering the olfactory apparatus and triggering whatever it triggers. So it's much more difficult to lie, let us say. However, when we look at writing itself, which these academics worship, and which these Scrabble Babble Looney Tune fools, you know, who want to usher in their social engineering utopias, they love the humanities. They love to rename things. They love to come up with new terms that you have to use to refer to things, and it creates a vast sense of disorientation because of the arbitrariness they worship, which makes their utopian project theoretically possible in the first place. They worship this arbitrariness. They think that every tool that we use for organization, for navigation, to get ourselves oriented in the environment, that it's all grist for their mill, that it can be cut up and rearranged and redone, and then next week redone yet again, and next week redone yet again, without any regard for what that does to our fitness, to our viability in evolutionary terms. I mean, if you take a look at the most fundamental way that human beings organize themselves, it is about orientation. So take, for example, the obelisk, right? The upraised gnomon. Like, you know, if you go to the Hippodrome in Istanbul, there's still an obelisk standing there, taken from Egypt once upon a time when the Ottomans ruled it. Go to Egypt, you can still see obelisks standing. These are gnomons. They are used to have a reference point against the movement of the sun and a shadow on the ground to track time during the day, and as a reference point to track the movement of the sky, of the stars, against that fixed point at night, allowing us to understand the passage of time and to orient. So they allow us to orient in space and time. And wherever we see human beings getting together to cooperate, you know, if a Roman castrum or camp is set up, the first thing that's done is they set up their banners at the center of the camp. If the Muslims, how do they organize themselves in space and time? They raise the spire up to the sky, a minaret, just like a gnomon, just like an obelisk. And what do they do 5 times a day? They do the call to prayer from it, and that orients people both in space and in time. Look at the early Christians. After we got past that point where everybody said that Spanish king was crazy for attempting to synchronize times across Spain, you have the idea of the or before and after that point, because at first they weren't synchronized. You have the idea of the clock towers appearing in what, the 13th or 14th, I think 14th century. And again, it's a tower and it's in the center of town. So it's a gnomon, but it also makes noise so that the person doesn't have to stop what they're doing to look up to see where the stars are relative to it, or the movement of the sun and the shadow relative to it. These central signs serve to organize the behavior of these people in space and time. And as soon as the worshipers of the book arrive with their insane focus on text and upon the permutations of text. So, for example, take the idea of gematria, which we can see with the Greek and Hebrew alphabets. Well, actually, we know that if this word has these letters, then these letters correspond to these numbers, and these numbers mean that this word has this value, and so that it has a secret correspondence over here. You crack open this world of arbitrariness or secret meaning, and it gets in the way of the type of non-arbitrary, clear, and motivated communication that we need to cooperate. So while over on the animal side of things, we do see deception, it's mostly interspecific between species. But when we get to human beings, and particularly commies in the humanities departments, but generally, as I think, a byproduct, that's what I'm pursuing as a possibility anyway, a byproduct of this idea of the sacred text against which everything must be measured, we get this idea of transforming the meaning of things, which we can see reflected in allegory, or what we call dog whistles, or even in pseudographia, the tradition of having a text that we put forth under someone else's name. So that theme, in closing, that theme is important, the idea of deception.
Oliver, the light bulb is going off, so I have to share a new idea with you. The receptivity, or should I say, the greater receptivity of written language to fabrication makes it easier for elites to monopolize control. So, for example, if language is arbitrary, then it is no longer expensive for those with power to deceive others into agreeing with them. So I'm clearly seeing the link between the arbitrariness of language and elite control. And by elite, I'm referring to people on the left and the right, but mostly the left.
Who show the greatest fascination with Scrabble Babble wordplay. Yes, the ones who come in and tell you that, we can no longer use the N word that means black. What we have to do now is use the term colored.
Well, that's an archaic term. We don't really say colored again. They just call black people in America African Americans or black Americans.
Yes, but I didn't finish the sequence. We have the N word, which means black, and then we replace it with colored. And then we say we can't say colored anymore. What we have to do is say black, which means the same thing as the N word back in its Latin roots. And then they say, no, we can't say black anymore. We have to say people of color. So they just basically arrive at 6-month intervals to throw everything into upheaval. And fundamentally, it doesn't matter what it is that they're getting you to change your terms for. What's most important is they constantly cause you to change the terms so that you are kept consistently in a state of disorientation and fear that you might be saying the wrong thing. Once again, it's this Scrabble Babble manipulation, and it's premised on this idea of an arbitrary relationship between the signifier and signified.
Oliver, I've interviewed many brilliant academics, and this is one reason why when I just started the project, I made a concerted effort to identify people who are not well known, because it's obvious that many of the better ideas in academia are emanating from ordinary people, people who have been insulated from political correctness and the Procrustean nature of modern institutions, like yourself.
Well, you're my friend if you use Procrustean as an adjective. I do all the time.
It's
yes,
conformist. Yes, that's why you don't have an abecedarian vocabulary. You're quite intelligent.
Yeah, I've now, mind you, this is the article I sent you was published in a peer-reviewed journal.
Yes, I know.
So I did make it in, and I did make it. I was invited by very friendly people abroad. I went to Sweden and I went twice to Leiden in the Netherlands and presented some of these ideas. But despite the fact that these were very friendly people and I was happy to present in front of them, although the image of presentation of one's buttocks in submission comes to mind when I say present, I found that they sort of just kept scratching their heads. There's such fundamental assumptions that underpin their understanding of signification and of what they would call writing, which can be distinguished as writing proper, that it's very difficult to get any traction with them, to get them to look at these things. I mean, just look at the way where, just out of a habit, and you can't be blamed for it, but just out of habit, you're like, well, what would this tell us about preliterate societies? Except the whole point is that this is a way of showing that there's no such thing. So there are many things that would have to be cracked open and reassessed, taking this approach. And, some time back, I thought I was the first one that figured this out. I'm like, oh my God, this is where writing comes from. It wasn't invented. We don't have to look at Schmidt-Besserat's idea of tokens appearing in Mesopotamia. We don't have to look at the idea of, the rise of abecedaries or, of phonetic writing. And then I came across one guy who looked at this and suggested it. And this was Carlos Ginzburg in his book on a variety of semiotics essays. He just has a few footnotes about it, basically. And that was done in the 70s. I think it's the rule of three or whatever. But then I discovered, someone pointed out to me, a Hungarian academic was kind enough, he had reviewed some of my papers, was kindly making remarks on it. And he said, you do recognize that when Carlo Ginzburg talked about this, he mentioned Kangxi and Fu Xi and their primordial Chinese sages associated with the emergence of Chinese writing. And in that tradition, it's specifically stated that the first sage who came up with the hexagrams and trigrams of the I Ching and then later of Chinese writing, that he was inspired to do so from looking at the traces left by animals. And so I think that there's long been this current of understanding. I mean, if you talk to any hunter, they're going to be like, yeah, I can figure out how this works because you look at the tracks on the ground, you know. But academics are never going to have that kind of exposure because they're in their little ivory towers.
Academics are blinkered by consensus. So we're wrapping up, but before we wrap up, one last issue on the table. Would a Newtonian science emerge had it not been for writing?
No pressure. A complicated question, easy questions there at the end, right?
Yeah, just be brief. It's something for you to ponder. You don't have to.
No, because the easy answer is no, because they needed mathematics and mathematical notation in order to express their ideas in a way that is falsifiable. So one of the best ways I ever heard mathematics and the broader field, whatever the damn term for it is, you know, all the varieties of what a lay person would call mathematics, is that it's a language in which you can lie, but you'll eventually be found out because it's susceptible to proofs, right? As distinct from spoken and written language, less so marks, according to everything I've already laid out thus far. But because of the notation that permits of the recording and the exposition of these ideas in this form, then whatever is asserted mathematically is eventually going to be susceptible to testing and proofs. So yeah, I would say that we couldn't have had these, you know, Newtonian developments or any other number of scientific developments without this form of writing, which is mathematical notation, which has no necessary relationship to spoken language whatsoever.
All right, so I'm going to end the show with this excerpt from a speech produced by Jack Goody. In other words, writing affects not only the method of recruitment and the occupational skills, but also the nature of the bureaucratic role itself. The relation with both ruler and rule becomes more impersonal, involving greater appeal to abstract rules listed in a written code and leading to a clear-cut separation between official duties and personal concerns. It is clear that the adoption of written modes of communication was intrinsic to the development of more wide-ranging, more depersonalized, and more abstract systems of government. At the same time, the shift from oral intercourse meant assigning less importance to face-to-face situations. And the point of this argument is just to remind some of us that there's a belief that writing elevates the quality of bureaucracy, but you don't need to comment. I'm just sharing this idea with our audience.
Very good.
All right, but Oliver, interestingly, I was planning to speak for like 1 hour because I read linguistics a bit, but my understanding of linguistics is superficial. So I'm familiar with major terms and some of the more famous academics, but I have not read widely in the field. So I said, okay, I'm not a specialist. I'm going to speak for 40 minutes. But you're so brilliant that the light bulb in my head just kept going off. So we have been speaking for over 1 hour.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. It was a pleasure to speak with you.
Yeah, it pays to be smart, Oliver. Bye.
All right. Take care. Thank you.
Yeah, man. All right. Bye.